If you like these videos, please check out my full course at www.lsat.totaltestprep.net with tons of clearly explained actual LSAT questions written by someone who's mastered test and helped others master it, and an evaluation period where you only pay if you want to continue.
All right, so in this video, we're going to go over the principal, justify, and illustrate questions. So what is the principal, justify, and principal illustrate question? So what do these questions ask for? What does it mean to use a principle to justify an argument? What does it mean to identify a principle which illustrates a scenario? How do these questions appear in the test? How do we approach these questions? Okay. Excuse me. In terms of the basic information, the principal justify, or illustrate questions ask you for the answer choice, which gives you a rule that connects the premises and conclusion in the argument, or is something that's derived from a scenario. So, a principle is a general rule that applies to specific situations and lets us know what the consequences of those situations are. In a legal context, a law is a principle, as are more general legal principles which are derived by judges from previous cases. So a principle can be a rule that justifies a judgment, or it can also be a generalization that is derived from a situation or scenario. Okay, so here the questions will generally deal with arguments. If the questions ask you to justify the argument or conclusion, then there has to be an argument. If it asks you for a generalization from a scenario, then it's generally not an argument. So they're generally going to be arguments, but sometimes they may simply just be scenarios. The question will generally deal with one speaker, though there might be multiple speakers, and if there are multiple speakers or multiple arguments, then the question will tell you where to focus. The answer choices will be additional information which can be taken to be true. Okay, in terms of the basic approach, if an argument is involved, you need to have a clear understanding of the argument, and you need to identify the choice which connects the premises and conclusion. The most important thing is to identify the conclusion and premises, which once again generally won't be the difficult aspect of these questions. You're primarily going to be looking for the premise and conclusion indicators. The more difficult variations are going to have a complex structure where the author responds to another perspective, and that's actually the common way in which they'll make the arguments more complex by introducing an additional perspective. So you want to be clear on the gap between the premises and conclusion. That's very important. You want to try and identify what the gap is between the premises and the conclusion. It's not as important to identify the structure of the argument, whether it's characterization or correlation, causation, etc., that kind of thing. You're more looking for conclusion, premises, and the gap. So you want to go through the answer choices then. Once you've got the argument down, you go through the answer choices looking for the one which provides a rule that leads from the info in the premises to the conclusion. The correct choice is going to close that gap between the premises and conclusion. And most choices will actually be phrased as conditional statements, or they can just be restated as conditional statements relatively easily. For the correct choice, the sufficient condition in that conditional statement is going to match up with the information in the premises and the necessary premises in the argument, and the necessary condition of the conditional statement is going to match up with the information in the conclusion, with the conclusion in the argument. The incorrect choice is going to be a rule that does not apply to that argument. So either it doesn't apply to the information in the premises, or it presents a consequence that differs from the conclusion. So you want to be on the lookout for, if you remember from the earlier conditional video, for false negations and false reversals. Now, if there's no argument, you need to have a clear understanding of the main elements of the scenario. So it's generally most important to identify the causal relationships and the evaluations that are involved in terms of whether something's good or bad, etc. In particular, you want to look for unexpected or contradictory or overriding consequences if they give you a causal premise or a causal process. So it's not an argument, so you're not going to look for premises and conclusions. You're going to be looking for these more fundamental elements. You're going to be looking for these main elements, not necessarily the premises and conclusions, because it's not an argument. You then go through the answer choices, looking for the one which provides a rule that is derived from the scenario in that paragraph, in the paragraphs. And the correct choice is going to express the key elements of the paragraph in more general language. And most choices will be generally not be phrased as conditional statements. So you're generally not going to find conditional statements. The incorrect choice is going to be a rule that does not apply to the information in the paragraph. it'll be irrelevant by introducing new information or a subsidiary element. Okay, so that's the basic difference if you see that there is no argument and you're instead looking for the principle that illustrates that scenario.